They said, "Turn off her oxygen. She won't last till morning." I heard it clearly, though it wasn't meant for my ears. It wasn't directed at me, but I heard it. It wasn't said with the tone of someone who feared they were making a mistake. No, it was cold, deliberate, matter of fact. The words hung in the sterile hospital air, mixing with the hum of machines and the distant clatter of nurses' shoes on tile. I could feel the weight of those words pressing into the room, heavy and final. I wanted to call out, to shout, but something stopped me. A strange calm settled over me, like I was suddenly watching everything from above. From the corner of the room, I could see their faces, distorted by the too bright hospital lighting, their eyes avoiding mine as they made the decision that I would never have the luxury of making for myself. I had been sitting there for hours, my body stiff from the IVs and the machines attached to me, and I had been waiting for them to realize what they were doing, waiting for someone to come and save me from this final, brutal choice. But no one came. I looked at my son, Richard, standing at the foot of my bed. His expression was unreadable, the kind of face you put on when you're trying to convince someone, or maybe yourself, that this is what needs to happen. His wife, Carla, stood beside him, her arms folded tightly over her chest. She was always so put together, so perfect in her expensive clothes and the cold politeness she reserved for situations like this. She looked at me like I was an inconvenience, like I had become a problem to be solved. I'd been here for days, my body recovering from a fall that had shattered my confidence more than my bones. And now, they were looking at me like I was a burden that had outlived its usefulness. "She won't last the night," they said. "It's the kindest thing." They didn't know it, but I had been preparing for this moment for years. Not in any tangible way, not with any thought-out plan or legal documents ready for a quick signature, but in the quiet recesses of my mind. There had been a time, not long ago, when I believed that my family would always care for me, that they would always see me as part of the puzzle, as something important to them. But somewhere along the line, I had stopped being a person to them. I had become a relic, a photograph on a mantle that you never look at unless it's time for a family reunion, a decoration you pass by without a second glance. Somewhere along the way, they had forgotten that I was not a thing to be discarded, that I was a woman who had lived and loved and fought for every inch of space I had ever occupied. Now, in this sterile hospital room, my son's coldness hit me with the force of a punch to the stomach. It was the final blow, and I felt it in every aching bone. I had always known that I wasn't the most important person in their lives. I had always known that my role was secondary, that it was the job of a mother and grandmother to quietly step aside and give way to the younger generation. I had accepted that, at least for the most part. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. This wasn't them needing me to step aside so they could live their lives. This was about them deciding that I had no right to live at all. I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at me like I was just something to be discarded, like an old piece of furniture that no longer served a purpose. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a nuisance. They had never been good at hiding their contempt, not after my husband passed. Not after Richard's wife, Carla, came into the picture, pushing me further and further into the corners of my own home. At first, it was small things. The way she would rearrange the furniture to suit her tastes. The way she would look at me with that polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. But over time, it became more pronounced. Richard, Once my little boy, who had crawled into my lap for comfort, had started to avoid me. He no longer called just to check in. No more visits on holidays. If I was lucky, I would get a quick text on my birthday, but even that became a chore for him. His life was busy. He had a wife. He had kids. And I had become a quiet, inconvenient shadow in the background of their perfectly curated world. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the moment, to focus on the quiet beep of the machine by my bedside. I wanted to fight, to stand up and scream that I wasn't ready to go, that I still had something to give, something to offer. But my body felt heavy, too heavy to move. My mind, on the other hand, was sharp, sharper than it had been in years. I could think clearly, more clearly than I had in ages. I knew that if I didn't do something now, if I didn't make a decision for myself, they would decide for me, and it would be too late. As the hours dragged on, I began to formulate a plan. It wasn't a grand plan, not something that would change the world or turn everything back to how it once was. But it was something. It was a choice I could make for myself. I could see Richard and Carla whispering at the foot of my bed, the hushed tones of their conversation barely audible over the machines. I watched them, their faces etched with a mix of impatience and cold detachment. I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, a slow, simmering rage that had been building for years. I wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Not in this hospital room, with my son and his wife making decisions for me like I was a child. I was done being their convenient little old lady who just sat in the corner, quietly watching as they moved on with their lives. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew that I would do something. I had to. For my own sake, if for no one else. I had lived my life on my terms, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me now. They thought they could just turn off the oxygen as though I was some kind of machine, easily shut off when no longer useful. But they had underestimated me. They had forgotten who I was, and I was going to remind them. The next day was when it all changed. I was awake long before the nurses came in, my eyes wide open, staring at the white ceiling above me, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly in the corner. The room was quiet except for the sound of machines, beeps and whirs that seemed to mock my stillness. It was a moment that could have passed like any other, but it didn't. It was the moment I realized the full weight of what had happened and what was about to happen. I lay there, trapped in a bed with tubes running into my veins, my arms feeling like they belonged to someone else. I could feel the cool air of the hospital room against my skin, and yet I was suffocating. I couldn't breathe the way I wanted to, not because of the oxygen mask, but because of the suffocating feeling inside me that seemed to grow with every passing minute. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, and I could almost hear the murmurs from outside, my family's voices. Low, quiet, almost as if they were speaking about me as though I wasn't even there, like I was just a matter to be settled. It was that moment, that surreal moment, when it hit me. I wasn't in control anymore. I hadn't been for a long time. They had taken that from me piece by piece until I was nothing more than an object in their house, a faint memory in their lives. I didn't know how long I had been lying there, lost in my own thoughts, when the door creaked open. It wasn't a nurse. It was Richard. His face, as usual, was a mask of concern. His eyes, however, gave him away. They weren't the eyes of a son who was worried about his mother. They were the eyes of a man who was already planning his next steps, already considering what would be most convenient for everyone. I had seen that look so many times before, but now it was sharper, colder. The pity was gone. There was no trace of the son who had once clung to my legs as a child, the one who had whispered in my ear that he would always take care of me. This man standing at the foot of my bed wasn't that child. He was a man who was no longer concerned with who I was, but only with the inconvenience I had become. "Mum," he said softly, his voice low but steady. "We're just trying to make things easier. We don't want to see you suffer anymore. You've been through enough. It's time to let go." He paused, as if waiting for some response, some sign of understanding from me. But I didn't give him one. I couldn't. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him everything I had been feeling for years. But the words got stuck in my throat, as though the years of being silenced had finally caught up with me. I didn't need to look at him to know that Carla was standing just behind him. I could hear her footsteps, the faint click of her heels on the tile floor. I didn't need to see her face to know the expression she wore. She was calm, distant, like she had been all along. Carla had never been a warm person. She didn't understand warmth or affection or love that wasn't tied to some kind of transaction. She had always seen me as an obstacle, a thing to be managed, a relic of a life that didn't fit into the perfect little world she and Richard were building. She wasn't concerned with me, not really. She was concerned with how I fit into the life they had constructed, the one they were proud of, the one where there was no room for anything inconvenient. "I'll give you a moment," she said quietly, her voice as polite as ever, her tone not quite dismissive but definitely distant. And then she was gone, leaving Richard alone with me. The door clicked shut softly behind her, and for a moment there was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that hung in the air, thick with unspoken words. Richard was still standing there, watching me with that same look on his face, the pity, the indifference, the quiet expectation that I would nod, that I would somehow accept what was happening. But I didn't. I couldn't. "Mum," he said again, but this time there was a hint of frustration in his voice. "Please, you need to understand that this is for the best. You've been on oxygen for weeks now. You're not going to get better. We've talked to the doctors and they all agree." It's time he stepped closer, and I could hear the faintest tremor in his voice, a sign that he was starting to lose his patience. But it wasn't pity I heard. It was guilt. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. I wanted to tell him I wasn't ready, that I wasn't ready to die. But I couldn't speak. The words were locked inside me, a knot in my throat that wouldn't budge. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me. I let it fill the room, drown out the sound of his voice, the sound of my own thoughts, the sound of the world that had forgotten me. And then, just when I thought I might suffocate under the weight of it all, I heard a small sound, soft, almost imperceptible. But it was enough to break the spell. It was the sound of the door creaking open again. It wasn't Richard. It wasn't Carla. It was a nurse. She stepped into the room, her face kind but tired, and immediately I felt something shift. Something in the air changed, just for a moment. She looked at Richard and smiled. "We need to adjust her oxygen levels," she said. It's time for the next round of medication. I'll need you to step outside for a moment. Richard hesitated for a beat, clearly reluctant to leave. He looked at me one last time, and I could see the guilt in his eyes, but I also saw something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. It was fear. Fear of what? Fear of what was happening in this room? Fear of what was happening to me? Fear that I was slipping away, even though he wasn't ready to admit it to himself? I didn't know, but I could see it. And that was enough. He stepped back reluctantly, and as he did, the nurse moved toward me. She adjusted the oxygen mask, checked the drip in my IV, and for the briefest moment, I felt a flicker of something inside me. Not hope. No. Not hope. But something like determination. Like the urge to fight, just for one more breath. I was still here. I was still breathing. And for the first time in days, I realized something. They could take everything from me. They could take my body, my voice, my will to live. But they could not take my right to make the choice. That I would not let them take. As the nurse finished adjusting my medication and turned to leave, I glanced at Richard one last time. His face was still shadowed with uncertainty, but I saw something else in his eyes now. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition. He had seen something in me, something he hadn't expected, and in that brief moment, I knew that he understood. I wasn't the fragile, helpless woman he had thought me to be. I was still here, still fighting. As the door clicked shut behind him, I closed my eyes again, my mind racing. I had to act. I had to do something. I wasn't ready to go. Not like this. Not while I still had a choice. The next day passed with the quiet erosion of dignity that only hospitals can offer. Subtle, persistent, and always dressed in sterile white. No one said the word dying anymore. It wasn't necessary. Everything in the room had already adopted the posture of quiet resignation. The nurse's movements were more efficient than tender. The curtains were always drawn halfway, as if fully opening them would be too much optimism. A chaplain passed by once but didn't stop. The tray of food they brought was soft and tasteless, barely touched. Someone had started logging my fluid intake on a chart taped to the wall, next to a monitor I couldn't see, but heard every hour, chiming like a bell that marked time I wasn't meant to have. It was in these small details that I understood what was really happening. They were waiting for me to let go. Not just of life, but of resistance. They didn't want a death. They wanted a seamless exit, like a patient being discharged from relevance. I had become a silent placeholder in their plans, something that needed to resolve itself before it became administratively inconvenient. Richard had stopped making eye contact. That was the first sign. The day before, he'd sat near the foot of the bed and at least attempted his strained brand of concern. Today, he paced the hallway, talking to people I couldn't see. I heard his voice through the half-open door, measured, bureaucratic, controlled. He wasn't discussing me as a person anymore. I had become a case, a circumstance. "She hasn't responded much," I heard him say once. "No, I don't think she'd want prolonged intervention. We've talked about it before." That was a lie. We hadn't talked. He had talked. He had made assumptions, woven a narrative that suited his schedule and his wife's distaste for chaos. And now that narrative was being echoed through clipboards and hallway conversations, translated into forms and options and protocols that slowly pushed me toward a quiet, polite ending. Carla came once that afternoon. She brought a stack of mail to sort in the corner chair, never acknowledging me beyond a thin smile that barely twitched her lips. I watched her hands move quickly over envelopes, fingers painted a soft beige color. Professional, forgettable. She looked like a woman who had long ago decided who deserved her softness, and I was not on that list. She didn't speak to me directly, just commented once aloud, not even lifting her head. It's a shame they never gave her more private space. These shared wings are so transitional. I don't know if she meant for me to hear. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she assumed I wouldn't understand. Maybe she assumed I was too far gone to care. But I did care. I cared deeply, viscerally, and each word etched another small scar across my ribs. Not because it was cruel, because it was casual. That night, as the hospital dimmed into its mechanical sleep, the fluorescent lights buzzing less, the hallway voices lowering, I asked for paper. The nurse, a tall woman named Elise, who had kind eyes but tired feet, hesitated at first. "Do you need to make notes for the doctor?" she asked. I shook my head. "I need to remember something," I replied. It wasn't a lie, not really. She brought me a notepad from the supply closet and a pen wrapped in tape. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from rage. The kind of rage that grows slowly, not with heat, but with weight. I wrote my name first, in capital letters, just to see it. Martha Harlow. Then I wrote today's date. Then my social security number. Then, line by line, I began to map what I remembered. Names, conversations, what was said, what wasn't, who stood where, who signed what. I didn't know exactly what I would do with this, but writing it down gave me clarity. It made me real again. Later that night, Elise returned. She brought a small paper cup of pills and a bottle of water. I asked her if she had a moment. She sat at the edge of the bed and glanced at her watch, but stayed. "Do you ever feel like you're watching someone be erased?" I asked. She looked startled, then thoughtful. "Yes," she said finally. "More often than I should admit." I held up the notepad. "Would you do me a favor?" She hesitated, then nodded. "There's a man," I said. "His name is Harold Trujillo. He used to be a paralegal, retired now. We used to play bridge. He owes me a favor. He knows a judge, Leonard, I think. I just need you to mail him a copy of this if anything happens to me." "Don't give it to my son, not even if he asks nicely." She looked at me a long time, then took the notepad gently. "You're not crazy," she said. "I know," I replied, "but that hasn't stopped them from trying to make me look that way." The next morning, everything intensified, but silently. A new form was placed at the foot of my bed. Advance directive. It was half filled already. Someone had put a sticky note on it. Waiting for signature. Family present. When Elise returned, she gently pulled the chart from its holder and flipped past the form. "This wasn't authorized," she whispered. "I'll stall." I wanted to thank her, but my throat was tight. It wasn't gratitude I felt. It was awe. The awe of watching one quiet act of decency disrupt a system that depended entirely on submission. I had been fading slowly, yes, But I was still here. I wasn't just a fading breath. I was a woman who remembered everything. Later that afternoon, someone else arrived. A young man, maybe late 20s, in scrubs too clean for someone who worked a full shift. He said he was with internal patient review. His badge said T. Harlow. I stared at the name. He noticed. "I'm interning here," he said. "I think we're related." My heart stopped for a moment, not out of joy or recognition, but from the sudden, destabilizing question of who had been pulled in to manage me now. "I'm Thomas," he said. "Your grandson, I think." "Richard's oldest." That gave me pause. I hadn't seen him since he was 8, the boy with the overgrown bangs and the Lego obsession. Now he stood tall and unrecognizable, but his voice had a familiar softness. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with something closer to apology. "I wasn't supposed to come," he said. "Dad doesn't want me involved. But I overheard some things. I thought you should know. There's talk about moving you to palliative care by the weekend. Fast-tracked. There's a note about declining cognition. But I saw your handwriting. It's clear. That's not dementia." I nodded slowly. "Will you do something for me?" I asked. He hesitated, then said yes. I handed him a small envelope I had hidden under the pillow. "There's a name and number inside. Harold. Call him. Tell him it's time." His jaw tightened. "Will they know?" I shook my head. "Only if you tell them." He nodded once, then slipped the envelope into his pocket. "You're stronger than they want you to be," he said. "That scares them." And with that, he left, as silently as he came. That evening, the hospital was unusually quiet. Too quiet. A kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from things having already been decided. Elise looked at me once and said nothing. I understood. The plan had already been set in motion, but so had mine. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next, yet they felt distinctly different. The quiet in the room grew deeper, more suffocating. As I lay in that bed, the steady rhythm of the machines and the occasional soft shuffle of feet outside my door marking the passage of time. It was as if the hospital had become a place where time stood still, waiting for the inevitable. Richard came and went with his polite smiles and carefully measured words. But each time he left, I could feel the distance between us growing wider, as if the space between us was widening by inches with every visit, making it harder to bridge the gap. Carla was always present, lurking in the background, her presence like a shadow. But it wasn't just her or Richard who made the space so heavy. It was the way the hospital staff treated me, the way everyone walked on eggshells around me, as if they were afraid that one wrong move would shatter the fragile illusion they were trying. So hard to create. I had become a problem, a ticking clock that everyone was waiting to stop. It was in the small things that I began to notice the cracks. The way the nurses' smiles were increasingly strained, how their eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting mine for too long. How the meals grew even more bland and tasteless, not even a hint of an effort put into them, as though they were feeding someone who didn't matter, someone who had already checked out. I began to see the hospital as an assembly line, a place where people like me, people who were no longer useful, were quietly pushed to the side. But I was still here. I hadn't gone anywhere yet, and I was beginning to understand just how far they were willing to go to push me out of the picture. The subtle manipulations, the half-hearted gestures of concern, they all became clearer the longer I stayed there, and the more I saw, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to let them write my ending. I wasn't going to let them dictate how my story finished. The breakthrough came when the judge's order arrived. It wasn't something I had expected. I had been too wrapped up in the small, day-to-day grind of fighting for my own voice to think about the larger game at play, the legal side of things. Harold had been the one to set it all in motion. I wasn't sure what he had said or how he had convinced the judge to act so quickly, but it didn't matter. The order was clear. It was my ticket out, my legal right to refuse the treatment that they were pushing on me. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest when I read the words on the paper, not just because of what it meant, but because it meant that someone out there still saw me as a person, still saw me as someone who had the right to make decisions about her own life, about her own body. The irony of it wasn't lost on me. Here I was, fighting for my right to live while my own family was fighting for my right to die. That evening, I made the decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. I was going to take the power back into my hands, take control of my life, even if that control was small and quiet. Richard had left for the day, and Carla had retreated to the lounge, her phone glued to her face as usual. The nurse, Elise, was the only one still in the room, adjusting my IV drip. I had learned to trust her, not because she was perfect, no one in that hospital was, but because she was real, and sometimes that was enough. I had watched her quietly rebel against the system in small, unnoticed ways, taking an extra moment to listen to me when I spoke, asking if I needed anything outside of the prescribed routine, making sure I was comfortable without being told to do so. She wasn't a savior, but she was a lifeline. And tonight, I needed that lifeline more than ever. "Can you get me the phone?" I asked, my voice soft but firm. I had rehearsed the words in my head, though they didn't sound as practiced as I wanted. Elise looked up from her work, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded and walked to the counter, picking up the receiver and handing it to me. My hands were trembling slightly, but it wasn't fear I felt. It was the rush of finally taking control, finally making a decision that was mine and mine alone. I dialed the number on the card Harold had given me. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" "This is Martha Harlow," I said, my voice shaking just a little as I spoke the name I had carried for so long. "I'm ready." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice cautious, perhaps even concerned, but not judgmental. "I'm sure," I replied. "I've waited long enough for someone else to decide for me." "I'm not doing that anymore." He didn't respond right away, but I could hear him scribbling something down. Maybe a note, maybe just the weight of the moment. "I'll take care of it," he said finally. "You'll be okay." I hung up the phone with a sense of finality I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them, not of the hospital, not even of what was coming next. I was done being passive. I was done waiting for permission. I was going to walk out of this place on my terms, even if it meant leaving my family behind. The next morning, something shifted in the air. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. It wasn't an obvious change, not something you could point to and say, "This is it. This is the moment everything turned." But it was there, subtle and insistent. Richard came in early, his face drawn with the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a battle he didn't want to fight. His words were different today, softer, like he was trying to reach out to me in a way he hadn't before, but I could see it in his eyes. He was afraid. He was afraid of losing control. He was afraid of what I might do next. "I've talked to the doctors," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed, his voice a little more strained than usual. "We're going to start the process today. You'll be comfortable. They'll take good care of you." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. He wasn't my little boy anymore. He wasn't even the man who had promised to take care of me. He was just someone who had learned how to let go, how to distance himself from everything that mattered. I wasn't angry at him. I was sad. Sad that he couldn't see what I was doing. Sad that he had given up on me before I had even begun to fight. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady and firm, "and I'm not going to let you make decisions for me anymore." His eyes flashed with something. Anger, frustration, maybe even regret. But whatever it wasn't enough to change the course of what was happening. I had already made my choice, and it was too late for anyone to stop me now. Later that afternoon, the doctor came in, a man I had seen several times over the past few days, but whose face had always been a blur of authority. Today, though, his expression was different. He was cautious, as if he didn't quite know how to approach me anymore. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, his voice warm but detached, "we're ready to proceed with the next steps. Is there anything you need before we begin?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of power. "No," I said, my voice calm. "I'm fine. I'll wait for the papers." And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not for them. Not for permission. I was finally free. The days after I made my decision felt like a fog slowly lifting from my mind. Each morning I woke, there was a moment, brief but tangible, when I realized that I was still here, still breathing, still fighting. I had expected the pressure to mount, to feel the weight of everyone's expectations pushing down on me as they tried to manipulate the outcome they wanted, the outcome they believed was best for me. But instead, the days stretched out in this strange, suspended calm. It wasn't a peace I was used to. It was the kind of calm you find in the eye of a storm, where you know something is coming, but you're not sure exactly when. I could hear the whispers in the hallways, the way people walked in and out of my room, their eyes darting to the corner where my family stood. Richard was more tense than usual. Carla, even more distant. They thought I couldn't see it, but I noticed everything. Their movements, their glances, their words. All of it spoke louder than the silence in the room. I had made the decision to live on my terms, not just to let go when they told me it was time. But with that decision came consequences I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't expected the pushback, the effort they would make to make me conform to their version of reality. Richard, who had been avoiding me for days, now came every day, his voice more insistent, his touch more frequent, as if he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers. "Mom," he said one afternoon, his voice softer than it had been in the past few days, "this is harder than it looks. We just want you to be comfortable." The words were an invitation, a way to soften the blow. But they had no meaning to me anymore. Comfort wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I needed. "I'm comfortable," I replied simply, my voice steady. "I don't need you to decide for me anymore." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw the frustration break through, something raw and untamed in his expression. It was almost a relief, because it meant that he had finally seen the shift in me. He had finally realized that I was not the woman he had tried to erase. "Mum," he said again, quieter this time, almost pleading, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to fight. I don't know what's happened, but you don't have to make things harder." It was the last thing I wanted to hear, the last thing I expected. What was he asking for? For me to lie down? To surrender? He wanted me to go back to the woman who had been invisible, the woman who had been a passive observer in her own life. But that woman was gone. I wasn't that woman anymore. "Don't make it harder for me," I said, my voice sharp. I saw the way his face fell, the way he stepped back, almost as if I had slapped him. But I wasn't sorry. I wasn't going to apologize for fighting for my own life, for demanding that I be seen. "I'm not going anywhere," I added, my words hanging in the air, thick with finality. "Not until I'm ready." Carla didn't come to see me after that. She was always the quieter one, always the one who seemed to hide behind Richard's decisions, never quite as direct, but always there, always complicit. I had never been able to understand her fully. How someone who had married into the family could so easily take the reins of my life without question. But after that day, I didn't care to understand her. What mattered was that they were both trying to do the same thing: erase me. I wasn't ready for them to have that power anymore. But it wasn't just Richard and Carla pushing against me. It wasn't just their faces, their voices, their attempts to make me fit into the role they had chosen for me. The hospital staff, too, began to feel different. It wasn't something they said, not overtly at least, but it was in the way they looked at me. Nurses who once smiled at me now averted their gaze when they entered the room. Doctors who had spoken with me about my condition in a calm and neutral tone now avoided discussing any future plans. They were beginning to align with Richard and Carla, quietly distancing themselves from me, from my decision to fight. Every time I saw them, I knew I had become a problem, a complication. But they weren't the ones who would make the final decision. That would be mine. The turning point came a week later when Richard hired a lawyer. The man came into my room one morning, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, his suit pressed and sharp, his expression carefully neutral. His name was Derek Sorensen, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had seen 1,000 cases just like mine. Cases where someone was ready to be silenced, ready to be pushed aside for the convenience of the family. He introduced himself with a kind smile, though I could see the lack of sincerity in his eyes. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I've been retained by your son and daughter-in-law to discuss your current situation." He sat down without waiting for permission, his eyes scanning the room with the same detachment I had seen in Richard and Carla. I felt a surge of anger, a tight knot of emotion in my chest. But I didn't speak. I didn't need to. "I understand that you've been through a lot," Derek continued, "and that you're going through a difficult time. But we need to discuss your wishes. We need to make sure that everything is in order, that we're following the proper procedures." I could hear the condescension in his voice, the way he thought he was talking to a child, the way he thought he could control the situation. But I wasn't the child. I wasn't the helpless patient he thought I was. "You need to tell me what you want," he said, his eyes cold and assessing. I looked at him, meeting his gaze squarely. "What I want," I said slowly, "is to be left alone. I want to make my own decisions, and I want you to leave." There was a long pause. I could see the surprise in his eyes, the way he hadn't expected me to push back. But I didn't care what he expected. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, his tone stiffening, "I'm here to ensure that your wishes are respected, but I'm also here to remind you that there are legal and medical processes at play. You don't have the final say in this." I didn't flinch. "I do," I said, my voice unwavering. "And if you don't leave now, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what's going on here." He stared at me for a moment, weighing his options. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he adjusted his tie as if he were preparing for a fight. But then, slowly, he stood up, straightened his suit, and gave me a curt nod. "We'll be in touch," he said. His voice clipped. And with that, he was gone, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the machines and the realization that they had underestimated me. They thought I would cave. They thought they could pressure me into doing what they wanted, but I wasn't going to let that happen. The next few days were filled with a quiet tension. I didn't see Derek again, but I knew he would return. They all would. Richard, Carla, the lawyer, everyone who had a stake in my death, everyone who wanted to control the narrative. But it didn't matter anymore. I had already made my decision, and they could do whatever they wanted. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I wasn't going to be a pawn in their plan. The first real breakthrough came that Friday. Harold Trujillo, the retired paralegal, called me directly. I could hear the urgency in his voice, the way he rushed to reassure me. "I've contacted the judge," he said. "The order's in place. You have the right to refuse treatment. No one can force you to do anything you don't want." I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by the sharp reality of what lay ahead. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. That night, after everything had quieted down again, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to make another move. I wasn't going to sit here and be pushed around. I had taken my life back, and no one was going to take it from me again. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days blurred together after the lawyer's visit, each one carrying with it the growing weight of the decision I had made. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about proving that I still had the right to exist on my own terms, in my own way. My family had made their move, but they had underestimated me, as if they thought I could be dismissed, overlooked, quietly nudged into a corner where my opinions and my voice no longer mattered. But I was still here, still breathing, still thinking, still capable of making decisions for myself, even if the world around me tried to convince me otherwise. I didn't care if they saw me as stubborn or difficult. I didn't care if they thought I was being unreasonable. I was done being reasonable. I had spent my whole life accommodating their needs, their schedules, their expectations. Now it was my turn to be heard. Richard came that morning, as he had every morning for the past week, his face drawn with exhaustion, his posture slouched as if the weight of everything was pulling him down. His eyes, though, were still sharp, still calculating, as if he were trying to figure out how to get me to concede, how to get me to agree to the plan they had set in motion. But there was something in his expression that morning, something I hadn't seen before. A flicker of doubt, of fear, of uncertainty. It wasn't just the stress of dealing with me, of managing a mother who had stopped obeying the script. It was something deeper. He was afraid of losing control, and he was afraid of what would happen if I truly took control back. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with frustration. You've been through enough. Why can't you just let us help you? We're trying to make things easier for you. We want to make sure you're comfortable. You don't have to fight this. His words were always the same, gentle, coaxing, but underlined with the thinly veiled frustration that came with not getting what he wanted. He couldn't understand why I wasn't just going along with the plan, why I wasn't just fading away as he had expected. And the truth was, I wasn't going to fade away. I wasn't going to be quietly dismissed. I'm not fighting, Richard, I said, my voice steady, even though I could feel the anger rising in my chest. I'm choosing. You're the one fighting. You're fighting to make me fit into your plans. You're fighting to erase me, to make me disappear so you can go on with your life without this burden. But I'm not a burden. I'm still a person, and I still have the right to make my own decisions. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words got stuck. I could see the moment of recognition in his eyes, the realization that I wasn't going to be swayed, that I wasn't going to be quiet, that I wasn't going to play the role they had written for me. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do. He was lost. He had been so sure, so confident that he could make me follow along, that he could force me into compliance. But now there was nothing left for him to say. The silence that followed felt suffocating, thick with the weight of all the things left unsaid. It was then that I realized how much of my life had been spent in that silence, waiting for someone else to speak for me, to make the decisions that I should have been making for myself. And I wasn't going to do that anymore. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But the words carried more weight than anything I had said before. This isn't about being comfortable. It's about being free. I don't need your permission. I don't need your help. I just need you to stop treating me like I'm already gone. I let the words hang in the air between us, knowing that they had hit their mark. He didn't answer. He couldn't. And that, in itself, was victory. I could feel the tension in the room, the heavy weight of expectation still hanging over us, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of what they would think, of what they would say. I wasn't afraid of the future, whatever it looked like. I had spent too many years living in fear, living to please others, living to make everyone else comfortable. And now I wasn't going to live like that anymore. I was going to live for myself, whatever that meant. The lawyer returned that afternoon. Derek Sorensen, with his polished shoes and cold smile, entered my room like he was walking into an office, like this was just another transaction to be completed, another case to close. He wasn't expecting resistance. He wasn't expecting me to stand my ground. But I could see the moment when it dawned on him, when he realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. He sat down across from me, his posture stiff, his hands clasped in front of him, as if trying to control the situation with his body language. "Mrs. Harlow," he began, his voice too smooth, too practiced. "I understand that you've made your decision, but we need to talk about your options. We need to make sure you understand the consequences of your choices." "I understand perfectly well," I said, cutting him off before he could continue. "The only consequence I'm worried about is losing control of my own life. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you that I don't need you. I don't need any of you." I could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes, but I didn't care. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to back down. He opened his mouth to respond, but I stopped him again. "You're not here to help me," I said, my voice unwavering. "You're here to make sure I comply, to make sure I follow the path you've decided for me. But I'm not going to follow that path. Not anymore." For a moment, the room was silent. I could see Derek's eyes flicking between me and the papers in his hands, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to respond. But there was no response left. There was nothing he could say to make me change my mind. Nothing he could do to force me into submission. I had already made my decision. I had already taken back the power they thought they could take from me. "You may think you have the upper hand," I said quietly, my gaze steady. "But you don't. You've never understood me. You've never understood what it means to fight for your own life, to make your own choices. And you never will. But I don't need you to. All I need is for you to walk out that door and never come back." Derek stood up, his face a mask of cold professionalism. But there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. It was a look I had seen before, in Richard's eyes, in Carla's. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of what would happen if I really did take back my life. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew the battle was over. He left without another word, and I was left alone in the room, but not alone in the world. For the first time in weeks, I felt something resembling peace settle over me. The storm had passed. The fight wasn't over, but I had won this round. I had stood my ground, and no one could take that away from me. As the door closed behind him, I leaned back against the pillows, closing my eyes for just a moment. I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. But I had taken back the one thing no one could ever take from me: my choice. And that, I realized, was all I needed. The days following that confrontation were quieter, not because the storm had passed. No, the storm was still there, just out of sight, lingering in the edges of my mind, a reminder that it was never truly over. But the pressure that had weighed on me for so long had lightened, even if only slightly. I had fought, and in that fight, I had found something I hadn't realized I was missing: my voice. It wasn't that I had one, at least not in the way people expect when they think of victory. The world didn't suddenly fall at my feet. There wasn't a great triumphant moment where everything was resolved and my family apologized, recognized their mistakes, and began to treat me with the respect I deserved. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't a movie where everything wrapped up neatly. But I had stood up for myself, and in doing so, I had regained the one thing that mattered most to me: control over my own choices. Richard still came by every day, but now there was a difference. His words, though still carefully measured, held a certain weariness, as if he realized that the narrative he had been pushing for so long wasn't going to unfold the way he had planned. He no longer tried to convince me to agree to their plans. He no longer tried to sell me on the idea of peace, of comfort, of being let go. Instead, he sat at my bedside, quieter than before, as if he were waiting for something. I could see the questions in his eyes, the same questions that had been in Carla's eyes too, but neither of them spoke them aloud. Perhaps they had begun to understand that some things couldn't be controlled, that some battles were not theirs to win. Still, the silence between us was thick, and despite the fact that I had regained my voice, I knew it wasn't the end of the struggle. It would never be the end, but it didn't matter. I spent my days in a kind of quiet peace. It wasn't peace in the way most people think of it. It wasn't a peace that came from external comfort or the absence of conflict. It wasn't the peace that comes when everything has been sorted out, when you've been promised an easy end. No, this peace was different. It came from knowing that I had fought for myself, that I had made the choice, that I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide my fate. I spent my days in that small room, reading, writing, resting, letting my body heal at its own pace. I had a long way to go, and I knew that. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced the worst of it. The fear of being discarded, of being forgotten, of being forced into a box I didn't belong in. And I had stood my ground. That was enough for now. One afternoon, as the light from the window shifted into that soft golden glow of late afternoon, Elise came to see me. She wasn't my primary nurse anymore, but she had been the one to listen, the one to recognize that I wasn't just a patient, that I wasn't just a case file. She had treated me like a person when everyone else had tried to treat me like a problem. That afternoon, she came into my room with a slight smile on her face and a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. "This came for you," she said, handing it to me. It was a letter, handwritten, not typed, and the ink was smudged in places, as if the person who had written it had taken care to ensure each word was just right. I unfolded it slowly, reading the words in front of me. The handwriting was familiar. Harold's, the retired paralegal who had helped me navigate the legal side of things when everything had started to spiral out of control. His letter was brief but thoughtful, the words carefully chosen. "Dear Martha," it began, "I know you've been through a lot, and I just wanted to take a moment to remind you that you are not alone. You've made the right choice. No one can take your voice from you, and no one can decide your future except you. I've made sure that your wishes are recorded, and you are free to live the rest of your days as you see fit. I admire your strength, and I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, remember this: you are a person, and your life, no matter how long or short it may be, belongs to you." I held the letter in my hands for a long time after I finished reading it. There were no grand promises in it, no declarations that everything would turn out perfectly, that everything would be easy from here on out. It was just a reminder that I had fought for myself and that I was still standing. It was enough. It was all I needed. Richard came by later that evening, his face lined with fatigue. But tonight, he was different. Tonight, there was no pleading in his voice, no attempts to convince me to change my mind, to see things his way. He had already realized that it wasn't up to him, that it was never really in his hands. But that realization didn't stop the undercurrent of sadness that ran through him, the soft resignation in his voice as he spoke. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he said quietly, sitting down in the chair beside my bed. "I don't know how to make everything right again." "You don't have to fix anything," I replied, looking at him steadily. "There's nothing to fix. I'm still here. I'm still me." "I know," he said, his voice soft. I didn't realize how much I was trying to take from you, how much I was trying to make decisions for you." There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, it was with a sincerity that I hadn't heard from him in years. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am." I didn't say anything for a moment. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words ever could. The apology wasn't about fixing everything. It wasn't about making the past disappear. It was about recognition, about acknowledging that what had happened couldn't be undone, but it could be understood. And that was enough. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new kind of normal. There were no more legal threats, no more pressure to make decisions I wasn't ready to make. Richard and Carla visited occasionally, though they were quieter now, less sure of themselves. They had finally come to terms with the fact that I was still here, that I had reclaimed my autonomy in a way they had never expected. They had thought they could push me aside, that they could dictate my fate, but they had underestimated me. And in that underestimation, I had found my strength. I knew that the battle wasn't over. It would never be. The world would continue to try to push me into a corner, to remind me that I was old, that I was fragile, that I was nearing the end of my life. But I wasn't afraid of that anymore. I had lived. I had loved. I had fought. And that, I realized, was enough. In the quiet moments, when the world outside my room seemed distant and far away, I would sit by the window, the soft light of the afternoon spilling across the floor. And I would remember. I would remember the strength I had found, the courage I had discovered within myself when I thought it was gone. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I had made my peace. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift I could give myself.